I just wanted to give basically an idea of where I think, my thoughts on the election, because wow, what a night. I'm going to be new to this, so just get used to the me looking down at the phone rather than up at the camera. But hey, um, yeah, I just wanted to run through a couple things, what I thought about the night, where I think we're going to go from here. Keep in mind my biases. I support the NDP. I'm a West Coast boy. I've grown up here, born and raised. So for any of you that might be on here, that's my biases. That's where I'm coming from. Um, Basically, I thought we just run down the parties and kind of think of where we go from here. So Trudeau, the Liberal Party. Maybe they come out as the biggest losers of the night, honestly. Um, Trudeau's still prime minister. I guess that's something to look forward to. But they dropped from 177 seats at dissolution to 157. They have one of the weakest minorities as a percentage of the vote share, at least, heading into this government. So that might be difficult for them to maintain somewhat of a mandate. Um, but apart from that, they are still the governing party. They have some options of who they want to work with. So this could either be a boon for Trudeau. He could manage to win the confidence of Canadians back, and this could just be a stepping stone to another majority. Or which what I'm hoping for is that he's kind of seen as the fake progressive by a lot more people. Because I believe he's not as truthful. He's somewhat of a fake progressive. He's so much of a faux progressive. So possibly people will start to transition to maybe the Green Party or the NDP. That would be the hope as working in this government. He ends up trying to maybe work more with conservatives and falls on his face, but I guess we'll see. The NDP. Uh, them too. They didn't come out in a terrible position. They definitely underperformed their polls. They won about 24 seats. I had them winning somewhere around 40, so they definitely underperformed, mainly due to the Liberal resilience in their vote. I figured a lot of seats that would have swung from the Liberals to NDP would, in a minority situation, would swing to the NDP. Turns out that the Liberal vote in places like Toronto, Quebec, the Atlantic, and BC, it did held up a little bit. So it's not like it completely collapsed. And it seems that their last minute strategies on the campaign of somewhat trying to scare voters into voting for a progressive government, not a progressive opposition, somewhat worked. It seems that those kind of NDP Liberal switchers broke in favor of the Liberals, and that's why we see where we are. That being said, um, the NDP is in a position of power. They are one of two parties that could be power brokers in this parliament. They possibly hold, they do hold the balance of power. We could possibly see some promises like pharmacare, dental care, that sort of stuff that the Liberals said they would be interested in coming to the forefront. I also think with the current political climate, they may be able to push electoral reform somewhat more. But it's going to depend on the electorate of Canada and seeing where we go from here. I think maybe people feeling a little bit hurt, a little bit conservatives feeling a little bit hurt, maybe more willing to have that conversation now. But I guess we'll find out. But they do hold the balance of power. And they beat out their doomsday predictions. So at the beginning of the campaign, there were people curious about whether the NDP could actually win even 12 seats. They did much better than that. They doubled that, in fact, with 24. So it does seem that Jagmeet Singh and this rise that we were expecting, this momentum, it did somewhat carry through, at least considering where we were at the beginning of the election. Um, the Conservatives. Let's start with the good for them. They won the popular vote. They increased their seat count. This is one of the, I think this is the strongest percentage of votes that the Conservatives have ever received. So, in that sense, it was a good night for the Conservatives. However, they did not win the plurality of seats. This was an election where Trudeau and the Liberal brand was very damaged going in, and this is something that the Conservatives should have been able to pull out. They weren't. They weren't able to do that. Scheer wasn't able to lead them to that victory, and now they're kind of stuck in a minority setting where they can't even work with just one other party to give them enough votes to hold confidence of the House. So likely, even if this government does dissolve, we won't see a conservative government after that. We will most likely just go back to an election, which really does restrict their power, and it kind of depends on how Trudeau wants to run this. If Trudeau wants to form a formal coalition or a formal agreement with another party, this is going to be a rough couple years for the Conservatives. If he is willing to go on a case-by-case basis, it's possible that the Conservatives can work on some energy files. It's possible they can pick up some support there, looking like they're standing up for Western interests. But apart from that, they're going to be somewhat powerless unless the Trudeau Liberals actually want to work with them. Ooh, I guess they dominated the West. That's a good thing too. But adding up all this stuff, I still think Scheer was the wrong guy to go with. And now it is coming from a lefty that lives on the West Coast. I'm not from Alberta. I'm not from Saskatchewan. I'm not involved in that part of the conservative movement. However, you guys picked someone as bland as toast. Like he's not. He doesn't have this charisma about him. He doesn't have this ability to, it seems like, really connect with people. And even though he got a large percentage of the vote, that could also be because, basically, because of the Western alienation that the country is feeling, this anger at Trudeau in the West. It's likely that if the Liberal Party was stronger, if their brand wasn't as damaged out here, this would not have been a success for the Conservatives. And I think that is due to a large part of the campaign that Scheer ran. Scheer is just as unpopular as Trudeau now as an opposition leader. He is, like I say, he has an inability to connect with voters. It seems that he lacks the charisma to kind of build momentum heading into an election campaign. So I think it will be interesting to see what the Conservatives do from here, whether or not they keep him or they toss him. That is an option, but in a short minority situation, they may want to just run with him as well and hope that he can build on the gains that they made this time around. Also, finally, for Conservatives, if anyone's even made it to this part of the video hearing after I'm a lefty, but they still wanted to hear what I had to say, this is my chance to speak to you guys now because welcome to being screwed by First Past the Post. How may I help you? The people on the left have been screaming about this for years, and it seems like our main opposition has always been right-leaning voters or right-leaning parties. We've understood for years that this system is unfair. First Past the Post does not work in Canada, and you guys experienced this last night. You experienced the anger that you can feel when your party is the most popular party in the country, yet you don't end up governing the country or even with the most seats. And this is a frustration that many on the left have felt for years. So if you're willing, we're willing to have this discussion. Let's have a talk. Let's move forward, and let's make electoral reform possible in this country. Bloc Québécois. That's an interesting one, actually. The role of the Bloc Québécois moving forward is going to be interesting. They ran aligned to the CAQ, which is a really popular party in Quebec right now. That forms the government there provincially. They're a right-leaning kind of nationalist party. They're not sovereigntists. They don't want an independent Quebec, but they do want Quebec to be viewed as a nation overall. They want Quebec to be somewhat special within Confederation, and based on their historical nationhood. So it was an interesting ploy for the Bloc Québécois to run a line to the Coalition Avenir Québec, but at the same time, and break with those old traditional lines with the Parti Québécois. But it is an interesting. It's going to create an interesting position in Parliament. The Bloc could and are in a position to work with the Liberal government if they would like to. Most likely, this will be on a case-to-case basis and a piece of legislation to piece of legislation, just because the Bloc Québécois hasn't said they're interested really in forming a federal or a coalition government or an actual like agreed upon government. They're there for the interests of Quebec, and that's most likely how it will stay. It will be interesting to see if the NDP were to pull support from the Liberals to see if the Bloc would continue to support them. But I think that's a story for a bit ways down the road, just because we just had this election. Even minorities tend to last longer than a couple days. And I think it will also be interesting to see like how Quebec issues impact this parliament. Having such a strong bloc and having those people that Trudeau can fall back on without really having to cave to the left all the time, I think we may see a more Quebec-centric parliament. It'll be interesting to see if the Bloc pushes at all for sovereignty or referendum. I think that would be a bad decision just because I think a lot of their voters came to them as a alternative for Quebec rather than a separatist party. And they could lose some of the gains that they've made. But at the same time, they could just skyrocket from here as well. And we could see sovereignty questions on a national stage again. And finally, the Greens. So the Greens had an interesting night as well. I mean, everyone had an interesting night. This is not a clear-cut election by any means, but they did well in BC. They picked up Elizabeth May obviously held her seat, and they managed to retain Nanaimo Ladysmith, which is something I figured they would, considering how long ago the by-election was. People tend to stick with who they put in office a couple months ago. But they also won in Fredericton. And that is an interesting one. That is one they were not expected to win. They were in play, but it wasn't so much expected that would be a Green victory. And now they have seats on both coasts. They're not just a regional party. So there is that to it, but at the same time, the Greens were hoping for better results. Let's be straight up honest here. They were hoping to gain at least 5-6 seats across the country, and they didn't. And that is going to kind of bring in where do we go from here with Elizabeth May? Does she decide that she's going to stay on as party leader? I think she has the support to. But I'm not necessarily sure the results have been there. So it would be interesting to see if the party decides to move to a more maybe younger, more kind of left-leaning individual. But I think that time will tell with that one. If this is a short-lived parliament and the party can gain more traction in that time, I could be wrong. But my guess is that they've kind of hit their ceiling. They're going to pick up 1 or 2 seats every election or so, but with 10 years to fight climate change, that's not nearly quick enough, and we need to find parties that are actually in a position to change our policies right now, so we aren't affected by climate change 10 years down the road when they might actually be in a position of power. And I want to just leave this off at the end here by kind of just putting some questions out there. People can feel free to answer these in the comments below or whatever. But basically just the ideas, at least the themes that I'm going to be watching for, at least in the next few weeks, couple months. Basically, again, does Quebec play a larger role in this parliament? Are their their issues more focused? Does this contribute to Western alienation? That's already very present there. I live in the West. I've been seeing the Wexit stuff all over Facebook. So it really is interesting to see if these Quebec issues do take more of a central role. How is that going to affect people at the West here? Are they going to feel even more left out of Confederation as they do already? And then basically, how does the government form? Do we actually see a formal agreement? Do we see a formal coalition? Or do we roll with something on a base-to-base case? Do we see them trying to pass legislation by using the votes of different parties and pitting them against each other? That would be the route that I think the Liberals will take. I don't think they'll form a formal coalition. I can't see the gain for them in forming a formal coalition. I think being the party in the center is probably where they are best positioned, at least politically, and that they will try and feed off the Conservatives on issues such as energy, and will try to feed off social issues with the more progressive NDP and Greens. And finally, as with all minority governments, how long does this one last? I guess my guess would probably be about 1.5 years. I don't see the government falling right away. No one wants to go right back into an election after we just had one. But at the same time, I don't see the Liberals coming as far left as the NDP would like them to. And I also don't see their support really that strong apart from maybe their natural allies in the NDP. So unless they're actually willing to work with them, this government likely won't last long. And you also have to factor in how public opinion is going to remain in those areas that are NDP Liberal switches. If the Liberals solidify their support in those areas and they actually see a boost after this election, then we might see a sooner election. The NDP will probably not be super interested in calling one, but other people might try and force one. If we see the NDP on the rise in those areas and in a position to actually take more liberal seats, well, then I think this government will last far longer than people expect. Most likely, in minority governments a lot about politics. It's a lot about getting policy done as well and creating stable policy, but a lot of it is about the power dynamics and what happens from there. So, thank you for taking the time to listen to this. I know I've been kind of ranting on for a while, so but if you like it, share it, like it. It would help. I want to try and get my opinions out there more. So, yeah, thanks for listening.